And welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have for the first time on the show, the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. He's been serving since 2019, resoundingly reelected in 2022, objectively speaking, doing a great job in Illinois. Governor Pritzker, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dean. Great to be with you.
So I saw a recent interview where you talked about your first interest in politics came from like your childhood, your mom and your dad. Share a little bit about that if you could. I'm always intrigued by the origin stories of why people get involved in politics.
Yeah, I would say, when you talk about nurture or nature, I suppose it was nurture, but it was so early in my life that it feels like it's in my DNA. My father had been the finance chair for Ed Muskie, who was running for president in 1972, and before that for a guy named John Tunney, who became a United States senator in 1970. My mother became one of the party officials for the Democratic Party. And I was in that time period, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. So you can imagine the impact that had on me. My father passed away when I was only 7, and my mother continued to be real activist. And we're talking about the mid 1970s here. So she dragged me around. I was the youngest of 3 kids. She dragged me around with her to meetings with gay rights leaders and with people who were pro-choice. And we went to pro-choice rallies when I was a little kid. So, whether you think I arrived at it for intellectual reasons or because my mother and father were involved, I'm not sure. But I landed from both directions in a place of being a progressive Democrat and somebody who believes in standing up for people who've been left out and left behind and, fighting for civil rights. And, I'd been involved in building a Holocaust museum and really believe in fighting for human rights for everybody. So that's how I came to my politics and running for office, of course, a whole different thing. But I'm pleased to have the ability to carry out the policies that I believe in.
Now, it's great that you share your parents, especially your mom's influence. I also saw that you cited the influence of Terry Sanford, who was the former head of Duke. My sister went to Duke, and her 2 daughters, my nieces, are in Duke right now. So it's a Duke family. I went to Fordham, which was the Duke of the Bronx, but it's not Duke. She's a little smarter. What can you do? But you talked about in an interview something that it resonates so much. What you're talking about. Terry Sanford worked to integrate the schools in North Carolina, and it hurt him politically. But to you, that's a lesson in standing up for what's right, even if it costs you politically. Could you share a little bit about that in your work with he went on to be a senator?
Yeah, I think that's a mark of bravery, to fight for something that is going to be politically damaging, perhaps for your next election, but that's just the right thing to do. And I believe that people sacrifice their political careers for getting something done that will make a difference in the world, that's something people ought to be willing to do. So I had the experience of, I was a student at Duke. I got asked to get involved in Terry Sanford's campaign, initially just in a small volunteer role. And then later I was hired onto the campaign. I created something called Students for Sanford, and then he hired me as his advance man. So I got to spend a lot of time with him on the campaign trail. And when you're learning from somebody who literally integrated the schools in the early 1960s, think about how courageous you had to be the governor of a southern state, integrating the schools when, George Wallace was standing in the schoolhouse doorway, blocking Black students from entering the classroom. So I really admired him, and he did so much for the university as well. And that's how I ended up on Capitol Hill. He hired me as the youngest legislative assistant in the United States Senate. And I guess the rest is history.
And I'm talking with Governor J.B. Pritzker from Illinois. And I just played yesterday, literally a minute of George Wallace's 1963 inaugural address, because on some level, these Supreme Court decisions, legalizing discrimination against the LGBTQ community, getting rid of affirmative action, even the student loan, getting rid of the cancellation, which disproportionately helps people of color. For some, it's not Jim Crow, but for some reason, they just conjured up the idea of segregation now, today, and forever. And it really troubled me. What's your reaction to last week's Supreme Court decisions that made a lot of headlines and broke a lot of hearts?
Well, this is a retrograde court. I mean, a plurality of the court was appointed by Donald Trump. These are folks who genuinely don't understand the challenges that people are facing, particularly people of color. When I think about the affirmative action decision, I think they want to go back to a time maybe when they were applying or maybe before to college when, basically if you were a white privileged person, that was almost a guarantee of getting into one of these great universities. And if you were poor, Black or Latino, that you had almost no chance of getting in. And for whatever reason, and I don't want to impugn, their upbringing or suggest that they are necessarily racist, but the impact of their policies is racist. And I don't think they understand. Some of them don't understand that. I am disturbed by the outcomes, and we now need to double down on finding ways to work around the affirmative action decision to make sure that we've got people of color getting into great universities and all universities that they might apply to, making sure that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion at those universities, because it is better for those of us who are white who go to universities to have a diverse education among a diverse population of students. And that's one basic reason that we ought to all be in favor of it, but it's also for justice. So I'm disturbed by the affirmative action decision. I think it has the biggest negative impact. Obviously, the LGBTQ plus decision around 303 Creative, that was just a ridiculously decided case. They relied on the idea that this was about a First Amendment right, that the person creating the website is using their creative juices and shouldn't have to somehow be forced to create a website for somebody that doesn't agree with them. And truthfully, well, you could just replace all the characters here with a lunch counter and Black people wanting to eat at the lunch counter. Well, I don't understand that, because that's where they're going with a decision like this. So I'm disturbed by that outcome, especially. So this court is going to be a dangerous court for us to live under. I am disturbed by the direction that they seem to feel empowered to go in. And I think we're going to have to, as a result, do even more to win over the Congress, to maintain the presidency, to make sure that we're enacting the policies that we know are the right thing for the future of the country.
Would you like to see Democrats in 2024, some of the leading candidates, I mean, President Biden, but also Senate and the House, making the issue of reforming the Supreme Court something of one of the top priorities we have, whatever reform it could be? It could be ethics laws, which we all need, we all agree we need, but either expanding the court or some kind of term limit, which is a little bit more constitutionally questionable, but something along the lines, just not status quo and hoping for the best.
Well, maybe we ought to start with getting corruption out of the courts. That may be the most important thing we could do, because you've got these conservative, wealthy donors who are essentially buying members of the court with their largesse. So I'm very disturbed that that hasn't already been something that the Congress has been willing to deal with. It needs to happen. Fortunately, our senior senator from Illinois is the chair of the Judiciary Committee. I know that he has talked about taking action in this regard, and I hope that he does that as soon as humanly possible, because I do believe that there is an organization, some might even say a cabal of right-wing people, donors, who are engaged in choosing who will get appointed to the federal circuit courts, the federal appeals court, and then, of course, the Supreme Court. And, just listen to Sheldon Whitehouse on this topic, because he's really figured out what the structure of their methodology is. And he's called it out. I don't think people have paid enough attention to that. We've got to, on our side, fight that and make sure that we're getting our nominees, President Biden's nominees, confirmed in the Senate, and making sure we're appointing good, liberal Democratic justices to the Supreme Court.
We had both Senator Durbin and Senator Whitehouse on the last month to talk about both issues. And Senator Whitehouse is remarkable it's like graphs and charts, and he shows you where the money's going. And you just sit there with your jaw open going, this is all legal, because it is. It's all legal. And there's something deeply wrong with that. And we all get it. So I'm chatting with Governor Pritzker. Governor, another big issue of the Supreme Court is something you touched on when you were a child. You went to rallies in favor of reproductive freedom. The Supreme Court last year struck that down. And now there are millions of women living in states where they have no self-determination, to be honest, and a lack of equality. What have you done in Illinois to protect women's rights? And what do you want to see nationally done?
We've done everything that we can think of, and we're continuing to work on it to protect women's reproductive rights. Yes, as I say, I come by this, by nature and nurture. And when my mother was rallying for women's reproductive rights, it was just the beginning of the Roe v. Wade 50-year period. I think any of us who are, who grew up during that period believe this could never happen, that it would be overturned, but it has happened. And it's happened during a term when I'm in office. And so as I look at it, I must do everything in my power, at a minimum, to fight for what my mother believed in, not to mention that is ingrained in me. And that is to make sure that women get what they deserve. This is a fundamental right for women to control your own body, to make decisions on your own about your own future. And so in Illinois, we've passed the Reproductive Health Act, which essentially codified our support for abortion rights in Illinois. It's a fundamental right in the state. We also are protecting women from being tracked, essentially, if they're coming across the border to Illinois, having their data used in a case against them in their home state if they're coming to Illinois as a refuge to seek their reproductive health rights, and so much more. And we're continuing to look at this question of how do we ingrain it in everything that we do, that women need to make their own decisions. They'll consult a doctor, they'll consult their own conscience, make up their own minds, and do what is right. And we are not going to let Missouri or Kentucky or Indiana or Iowa or Wisconsin, those are the surrounding states to Illinois, which are limiting women's rights or eliminating them altogether. We're not going to let them decide what's right for Illinois or for the women of Illinois.
It's remarkable, just when you're talking about protecting women so their data can't be used against them to prosecute them in their home state, that this is the United States of America in 2023, and this is a conversation that has to be had. Now, you mentioned the surrounding states. So often when we talk about gun violence, the right will say, look at Chicago, they have strict laws and there's gun violence there. Those same neighboring states that restrict women's right to control their own destiny, wouldn't it be nice if they started passing laws to make it harder for people who shouldn't have guns to have guns? And maybe that would save lives in their state and your state?
Preach. I mean, what you just said is right. A study was done that 60% of the violent crime that was committed on the streets of Chicago was committed with guns that came into Illinois from Indiana, where they have almost no restrictions. Now, we have reasonable restrictions in Illinois. The Supreme Court has said that there are limits to the restrictions you can put on, but we have reasonable restrictions. You have to get a FOID card, a firearms owner identification card in Illinois in order to own and operate, use a gun. We have, by the way, banned assault weapons in Illinois. We banned assault weapons. We banned high capacity magazines. We banned switches so that you can't turn a regular gun into a machine gun. And one of the reasons that you see continued violent crime with the use of guns is precisely because you can go to Missouri and get a gun very easily. You can go to Indiana, any of our surrounding states, Kentucky, and we're doing everything we can to interdict, to stop the trafficking of those guns across the border, but it's near impossible. You can just drive over to Indiana. There are 3 stores. We know exactly where they are. We are not allowed to track you going to those stores, of course. And we don't know that you've been to those stores, but when you cross back over on the Illinois side and you don't have a FOID card and you've just bought a gun with essentially no regulations on who could get a gun, we're unfortunately the victims of the poor decisions that are being made by elected officials in those other states.
Yes, and I know that just on 4th of July, you were honoring the victims of the Highland Park shooting, which happened last 4th of July. Very last question, although there's others I have, we're running out of time here. You signed a law, I think with the first in the nation in June, to prevent book bans. Like we're seeing certain Republican governors Ron DeSantis is not alone, but Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, and others banning books that for their own agenda, they don't want students to read. Could you share on the last point here, the last minute, what you're doing and what that law does?
Sure. Let me just remind you, the Republicans stand up and say they're fighting for freedom. They're not fighting for freedom. I mean, look at everything that they do. What about just the freedom to not get shot on July 4th by a semi-automatic weapon? Or the freedom to make your own decisions about your own body with reproductive rights. And here, what they want to do is limit what you can access, read, that's, age appropriate. But they want to limit, they want to essentially say that, if you don't want to have Mark Twain in your local library, you should be able to ban it. And the reality is that obviously, the right wing wants to make this an extreme thing where they're saying, oh, well, you're going to let kindergartners access pornography. That's ridiculous. There are standards. Librarians set those standards. There is, in fact, a Bill of Rights that the Librarians Association has created. And what we're saying is every library should adopt that Bill of Rights. And that if you're going to ban books that are inappropriate to ban under that Bill of Rights, then you're not going to get any grants or any money from the state of Illinois. And libraries live and die on the support that they get from government. And so we believe that it's an effective law for maintaining the rights of parents in their local community to either have the book available in their library for a child to read, or to tell their child, you're not allowed to read that. But it's librarians who set a certain standard. They are professionals. There's a Bill of Rights, and we're just asking the communities follow that. We want to preserve your freedom to decide for yourself about what you're going to read, and to decide for your own children what they should be able to read.
I think the Republicans' definition of the word freedom doesn't match what's in the dictionary or what we commonly understand freedom to be, because I've never seen a movement less about freedom and more about oppression than the modern day, this wing of the GOP that we're dealing with. But Governor, thank you so much for your time. It was great having you on. Hopefully you'll come back on in the future. We can talk more about Illinois and the history there of politics as well, and about the great work you're doing in your state.
Thanks, Dean. Always great to be with you.
Have a great day.